Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The dialogue Fireside Chat of the Research Hub on Institutions of China is about to begin. Please be seated and switch off your mobile phone or any other sound-emitting devices. Thank you. We will start our activity in 3 minutes. Please wait for a while. Thank you. Mr. Malcolm Clarke, Ms. Han, guests and participants, welcome to the Research Hub on Institutions of China, the Dialogue, Fireside Chat. I'm Zhang Zhenyu, the Master of Ceremony today. May we now invite today's guest, two-time Oscar winner and 16-time Emmy winner, director Malcolm Clarke, and famous film producer Ms. Han to the stage, please. Ms. Clarke and Ms. Han, please be seated. We will also invite the guests in dialogue for today's fireside chat, youth delegate Mr. Larry Lee, PhD student of Hong Kong U, and moderator Dr. Yan, director of the Research Hub on Institutions of China, to the stage, please. Dr. Yan and Ms. Lee, please be seated. It is time for the fireside chat.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's event. We apologize for the delay because of traffic and other issues, but we are here now. So welcome to the first event of our Research Hub in 2023. This is also the first fireside chat in the series of the dialogue. I would like to thank the guests, students, and colleagues for being here today. Especially, I would like to thank the audience on the internet now watching this event. I would like to thank News for live streaming the event now. We appreciate your help. And I would like to thank Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han for being here today with us. I would probably we don't need much introduction of our distinguished guests, but I just want to say something very important, that Mr. Clarke is an English documentary filmmaker. He began his career at the BBC, directing everything from the nightly news and documentaries to game shows and music programming. His first Oscar win came in 1989 at the 61st Academy Awards for You Don't Have to Die. That won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Subject category. The film was about a child battling cancer who inspired other young people with the same disease. In March 2014, Mr. Clarke received his second Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Subject for the 2013 film, The Lady in Number 6. This 38-minute film tells the story of Alice Hurst Summer, whose devotion to music and her son helped her survive 2 years in a Nazi prison. In 2020, Mr. Clarke and his team were staying in Wuhan during the outbreak of the pandemic, and eventually they produced a documentary film called Wuhan, A Season in Hell. And the most recent documentary series I just also watched is of Mr. Clarke. It's called Long Cherished Dream, which is about China's poverty elevation, and is a portrait of everyday people in China, which I would highly recommend to everyone to watch. Ms. Han is a multiple award-winning film producer, and with expertise in international co-production, strategic marketing, and distribution of China-related independent films. Her producer work includes acclaimed feature documentaries Better Angels, China's Heavyweight, and The Last Train Home. Her first directed film, In My Eyes, was in competition at the 2018 Shanghai International Film Festival. Prior to focusing on the film business, Ms. Han was an anchor and a news reporter for Sichuan Provincial TV station, and also China's Central Television. So without further ado, probably we just invite Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han to give some opening remarks, and then we will just enter into our conversation. Mr. Clarke first, please. Yeah.
Okay. I know that normally in these fireside chats, your guests, generally speaking, make a speech. And I have asked specifically that I don't make a speech because I find that, first of all, I'm not a very good speech maker. And second of all, I think, you know, a dialogue where we can all talk and ask questions and have a kind of a two-way street is a much more effective way of describing to you guys what it is that we do in our lives. So I'm going to be very brief with this. You've just heard a little bit about my career and my past. Generally speaking, I've made films in many countries. I've traveled a lot, and in about 2011, I was asked to make a film in China, and although I hadn't realized it at the time, it marked a kind of a genuine kind of departure for the kind of thing that I do, because generally speaking, I've gone from one subject to a different country to do a different film, and then to a third country. So over my career, I've made films in 86 countries. I had never made a film in China, and although I was sent when I was a kind of a baby, when I was in my early 20s, I was sent to China by the ABC network in New York to research a film that I was supposed to direct. But after 9 months of traveling around China, China basically stopped that film from being made for political reasons. And so the 9 months of research was, to some extent, aborted, except that I had the opportunity to see at very close hand, in many, many different parts of China, what was happening to this country after the Cultural Revolution, after the Great Leap Forward, just at that kind of, that inflection point where China was beginning to open up. So I was intrigued. I didn't come back to China until I was asked to make a film by two very august, famous Americans, Henry Kissinger, who everyone knows, and a man called Robert Mundell, who won the Nobel Prize in 1999 for economics. Both of these men had been, during the course of their long lives and careers, they had been friends of China and supportive of China. And they asked me to make a film which could explore the future of the relationship between the United States and China. And I didn't really feel that I was qualified, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian, and I'm certainly not a sinologist. I'm just a filmmaker. But they pressed, they kind of insisted, and candidly, Henry Kissinger is not someone you say no to terribly easily. So at a certain point, I relented, and we decided to make a film that became Better Angels. And it was a film about what we could predict could be the positive relationship between the two great superpowers on the planet. So it was a very exciting film to work on, except that we were making it in the shadow, the long and very dark shadow of Donald Trump. We started making the film when Trump was campaigning for the presidency, and the film was entirely directed, produced, and completed during the Trump administration. And as we all know, Donald Trump used China in a very particular way politically, and really kind of poisoned the discourse between America and China. And it made it very, very difficult for us to find an audience for this film, because we were looking at what could be taken as a positive between the two countries at exactly the point where Trump was demonizing China. He had a kind of a toxic effect on the discourse. And to say anything positive about China was to be branded, to be labeled, to be dismissed as being in the pocket of the People's Republic, of being a propagandist for China, and therefore to be for the film to be not taken seriously, because it was pure propaganda. And that, unfortunately, was it was the reaction not just of people in the right wing of the American political spectrum, but from centrists, from people who, frankly, should know better. But so it was a difficult film to make. It was. I'll cast modesty aside for a second, and I'm very proud of the film. Hanyee produced it. It was a very difficult film to make. We went all over the world to make the film, because if you're making a film about modern China, China as a rising power, you're now obliged to go to Africa, to go to Central America, to go all over Europe and across Asia, because China is a global presence. China is a global power. And that was what was very striking about the film, that China was an international presence. The renaissance of China was something which we dealt with it in some detail. And frankly, the film frightened Americans. It was a film which endorsed the thesis that China was coming. China was going to eat their lunch. China was going to be a negative presence in terms of American preeminence in the world. So it was a difficult birth to get this film made. However, on the positive side, I kind of fell in love with what China was. I honestly did not understand China, and candidly, I still do not understand China, and probably never will. But what I saw in China was a country that was vastly misunderstood, and in my mind, unjustly accused of many sins that I just didn't feel justified the kind of reception in the West that China was getting. So I decided to stay in China. I decided to try and make more films about China, films that could be shown particularly in the West. I don't need to explain China to the Chinese. They pretty much know what it is, both good and bad. But in the West, there is so much misunderstanding. There's such a profound lack of comprehension, no knowledge of history, no knowledge of tradition, no knowledge of civilization. And I just felt that there was a role for me as a filmmaker to try and interpret, not Chinese politics. I couldn't get into the politics. I never make a political film. What I do is I make films about Chinese people. And the fundamental law, if you will, of making films for me is that we have to understand the Chinese people emotionally. We have to understand what makes them tick, why they get up in the morning, why they love, why they hate, what they fear. And if you can do that in a film, because a film is a hugely powerful soft power tool, if you will, and using fashionable language, if you can show that the Chinese people are very similar in their fundamental emotional kind of reactions to the world and all the things that happen to them every day, if you can show that a Chinese person from Wuhan is the same as an American, fundamentally, from Chicago or from Los Angeles or from the Midwest, if we can explain to people in the West that China is not that different, and it is certainly not something to be feared, then I think there is the possibility that we can bring West and East a little bit closer. Maybe I'm naive, and I'm often, often accused of being a little bit too optimistic for my own good, but I think it's a better mental state for me to inhabit, to be optimistic about the future rather than pessimistic. So that's why I do what I do. I'll leave it there because I don't want to turn this into a long speech, and let my producer do the talking. And I will say one thing about Anyi. We worked together on Better Angels. I told her the job was a 18-month job, 1.5 years she would be. That film, I'm still embarrassed to say that film took almost 5 years. So as well as being a good, strong and kind of accomplished producer, she is extremely patient.
You stole my speech. I was going to tell this little anecdote, but it was stolen. We worked together since Better Angels. And when I was approached to make Better Angels, it was not even 18 months. It was 2 months for me. Like you said the shooting that was going to be done in China would probably take 2 months. And I said, okay, 2 months' time, it's kind of okay. And then it turned into almost 6 years to finish that film. But it's been a wonderful experience for me because prior to Better Angels, the films that I was involved in was mainly character-driven long features. But Better Angels is something quite different. I mean, it is an intimidating subject because it's abstract. Now, how do you deal with the future of the relationship between United States and China in a 19-minute film format? That's, for me, is just a challenge. But obviously, there's a lot of, at least on my part, I find it challenging to try to figure out the stories and the images and how do you, the format itself, how do you tell a visual story? And most importantly, how do you make it emotional? You're not writing a thesis paper, you're not listing all your points, but you have to find the right characters both in China and in the US and all around the world, and also make their stories emotional and resonate to the audience. I found that experience very fascinating. And, Malcolm will say, put the modesty aside. He is a great director to work with. He always knows what he wants and very focused. So the reason why the film was taking too long was not on the direct side, was just because of everything combined, the political situation, mostly, and also we ran into censorship problems both in the US and in China. So in the end, it took 6 years to finish. But we've developed a very good working relationship, and ever since then, we've been working on other films like Long Cherry Stream you mentioned, and Wuhan, and some other subjects. So it's been Malcolm's interest in China is great. I mean, this topic is about through a foreigner's lens. They do have a different take on China. which is certainly different from us. But I think have a mutual first understanding and also discussion about all the film subjects that we're making. I was able to also offer some guidance on the Chinese sensitivity. So it's been a great pleasure, actually. And I hope the films that we've made had showed one part of China or one side of China that you don't normally get from the Western media. Also, you don't normally get from Chinese mainstream media. So we're hoping that we could provide a third perspective, which is different from the official narrative in China, also different from the Western narrative, because I think those two narratives, they're fighting. So sometimes you need a more personal approach and a little bit of a distance. Hopefully that by doing so, we could provide one aspect of China that tells the individual stories about Chinese people, about Chinese culture.
Yeah, thank you for the opening remarks. So probably now we will just enter into our chat. We have Ms. Larry Lee here as our guest in dialogue today. Larry is a doctoral student at Hong Kong U, but he is also the so-called post-95 generation. So it's a younger generation. So probably I would just turn to Larry first, because Larry is also a long time audience of the films made by Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han. So what is your general comment? What is your general impression of the documentary films made by Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Yan. And first of all, I'm very honored to be here today to join the talk. Sorry, is it working? Yeah. First of all, I'm very honored to be here to join the talk with Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han. So I received the topic a couple of days ago, and I've been constantly thinking how to conceptualize the China through the lens of Mr. Clarke. We all know that there is a lot of documentaries and advertisements about China nowadays, and they've been featuring bridges, skyscrapers, high-speed railroads. These are just one valid way of representing China to the world, but I think it's lack of something that is really humanistic. And I think that's the reason why it's pretty hard for the outsiders, for the foreigners, to connect to. So they've been constantly telling us that what happened in China in the past several decades is a miracle. But what I think Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han has been using their documentary to tell us that there is nothing miracle about China's rise, right? There is nothing miracle about China's sea change in the past several decades. I think it's definitely by focusing on the ordinary people. I think Mr. Clarke has shown us that it was the result of years of hard working and generations of hardworking people. So we've seen that unlike other documentaries or advertisements or narratives about China, we don't really see a lot of, we don't really see just smiling faces or like proud faces. We've seen faces with vicissitudes, right? We've seen faces with confusions, with contradictions, with fears, with all these human sentiments, right? But also we've seen faces with resolutions and resilience. And I believe that's the thing that's so powerful and so touching. And that's also the thing that makes people even outside of China can connect to, right? And I think that is the thing that makes the story of China into a shared human story, I think. And I believe that is the reason why the whole narrative is so real and honest.
Yeah. So this is the direct feedback from the Chinese audience of your films. So would both of you or either of you want to respond to the feedback?
My experience is that when someone says something nice about you, you just let them go. So, you know, when I first came to make Better Angels, shortly after that, actually, shortly after I got to China, there was a hugely successful CCTV television series, which I think everyone in China saw. In fact, we would go to restaurants as we were shooting Better Angels, and this television series would be playing over and over and over in restaurants because it was so beloved by the Chinese people. It was called A Bite of China, and many of you probably maybe saw it, certainly heard about it. It was hugely popular. It was terrible. It was wonderful on food and terrible on the people who actually made the food, who harvested the food, who ate the food. It was a kind of a long series. It was like a coffee table book, one of those thick books of beautiful photographs, beautifully photographed and very, very well made. But fundamentally, I found it terribly disappointing because at the center, at the heart of it, the people were missing. And, you know, the preparation of food, the consumption of food, the consideration of food is a human endeavor. But if you take the humans out, I remember one little scene where these guys were harvesting honey, a very special kind of honey. I think it was in Yunnan. And they were climbing trees to get to the bee hives that were high in the tall, tall trees. They were risking their lives to do this. They had no safety net. They had no safety equipment. They were scrambling up these trees. And I thought, that's the story. But in this film, the honey was the story. And you cannot interview, no matter how clever you are, you cannot interview a bee. And I just felt that this was a kind of emblematic of a huge missed opportunity. Because if we had understood the chefs, the people who prepared the food, the people who harvest the food or catch the fish or hunt the wild game, then we have a fantastic picture of China. And yet they were systematically taken out of the narrative. So that was a little kind of lesson for me as a director, because I thought if I ever get an opportunity to do more work in China, bear in mind this was my first film, Better Angels, I thought if I ever get an opportunity, I'm not going to make that mistake. I'm going to concentrate on the guys who risk their lives climbing the tree to collect the honey. And that has been a kind of a fundamental building block of everything that I've done in China. There is no miracle in China. Chinese people have worked themselves almost to death since the revolution. They've turned around this country. When I came the beginning of the 80s, and then when I came back in 2014, it was like I'd gone to it was very hard to process how profound and so how extensive the change had been. And that only happened because millions and millions of people worked themselves almost to death. Not necessarily with much reward, I have to say, but they did turn around this country, and they made it a country, frankly, to be feared. Not to be admired, but to be feared. Why? Because, with great respect to the gentleman in Beijing who implemented this miracle, the Communist Party, they have no idea how to tell their own story, to tell about this profound change. As you said, I think you said, they tell the story of the fastest train and the highest bridge and the longest tunnel and, thousands and thousands of kilometers of new highway. But again, they don't tell the story about the guy who got the job to drive the train, if that's the right word, between Beijing and Tibet. He's really interesting because that's a very prestigious and very difficult job to get. Somehow he got it. There's a film. There's a story. The guys who dig those tunnels, there's another film. Because every one of us has something unique. And if you can if you can gather those unique aspects of people's lives, their loves, their hates, their anxieties, their struggles, and their dreams, because Chinese people have never been allowed to dream. Now they can. And I think that is the biggest achievement of the revolution. It's the biggest achievement of the government. It's the biggest achievement of what has happened in China over the last 40, 50 years. Chinese people can now dream. They can have ambition. They can realize those ambitions. They can be smart, but if they're working in a rice paddy, all the IQ, all the intelligence, all the originality, the creativity goes nowhere. But if they can channel those qualities and those ambitions, China will be a better place. The world will also be a better place. So that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to propagandize for China, but we're trying to tell the truth. Not so much about the achievement, but very much about the people who implemented that achievement.
Yeah.
I think not that they haven't featured any people in these series. They have, and I think they wanted to, but they just didn't try hard enough. So the stories weren't deep enough. You get a sense of it. They just glance over. Most of the times they just tell you what they do, but didn't really go deep into why they did it, how they did it, and what the consequences of all those things they've done for their family and for the society. I think that's probably the reason why you felt like, everything is just about food. They tried. I know the team, I know the filmmakers, and they have this theory of, if you want to grab the audience attention, you have to always feed them new stuff, which I tend to disagree because I think if a person is interesting enough, you will stay with them. You don't need to switch to another story every 8 minutes. I think it's because you didn't dig deep enough to really grasp the story of that particular person. But I agree. There are different approaches of filmmaking, and if you look at the majority of the Chinese traditional documentaries, they all focused on objects, not necessarily people, because we like to have big ideas or big planning. We tend to use a different approach, really centered on people, because people and emotion is the only thing that can travel around the world, no matter where you are. You understand love, you understand friendship, you understand family values. You don't need to, have to be in the same culture. All those emotion-related areas, it's very easy for people to understand. You don't even need the words sometimes, because picture, right, worth 1,000 words. A good one is worth thousands of words. It's if you see these people is happy, he's happy. But just because I think there's a different schools of thoughts. There are other approaches. We tend to believe that only when you focus on the human emotions, stories can travel. And other people from Africa, North America, Europe, they would understand. They will understand how you feel when, your family is going through, for example, COVID situations, right? And they will understand when loved ones are apart. They will understand birth, death, getting old, all those general themes of every single human being would experience. And I think those areas would travel more easily than about a particular objects. Yeah.
Or a particular side.
Yeah. Okay, we just talk about, I think that's a very important point, that people share the same emotions and people share the same side. But my next question is probably a bit different from this, because I know, Mr. Clarke, you have made films in over 80 countries or regions in the world, and Ms. Han, also you made films in many different countries. Larry, I know, is a traveler to different countries in the world as well. So for each of you, what is the most significant difference between China and probably the rest of the world? What is the most significant feature of China? Probably we just start from Mr. Clarke and then Mr. Han and Larry. Yeah.
Chinese people are afraid of emotion. Fundamentally. It's not that they are afraid to be emotional amongst themselves, but from a filmmaker's point of view, from a Western filmmaker's point of view, I shouldn't and will not generalize and say that all filmmakers feel the same thing. But from my point of view, largely because I am Western, I don't speak Mandarin, I don't speak Cantonese. I can only relate to my subjects through Han and her team. And the one thing that is a kind of fundamental tenet of any documentary film, certainly, is that you have to win the trust of your subjects. If they don't trust you, they're not going to tell you anything. And even if they trust you, they're going to be reticent to divulge anything which is sensitive, controversial, something they don't want their relatives to hear. It's interesting. I used to work in New York, and I used to get a very early bus in the morning to ABC. And I got on the bus at the terminus, one of the first people on the bus. And often, when I was sitting pretty much alone on the bus, at the next stop, someone would get in, and they'd sit next to me. They wouldn't go sit someplace else. And so many times, I found myself talking to a complete stranger on the bus early in the morning. Maybe I have some kind of little fairy dust. I don't know, but people find it easy to talk to me, and I find it easy to talk to strangers. And I think that's one quality that I don't question, I don't really understand, but I know that if I meet someone, I can, if with enough time and with enough gentle pressure, I can open them up. Now that's me saying, I can do this. I cannot do it in China. I cannot do it because I don't speak the language, but even if I did speak the language, Chinese people tend to have a kind of carapace, a kind of little shell around them where they don't want to open up too much. They're shy. Maybe it's a question of face. It's culturally different, and it's much, much, much more difficult to get inside and get them to really tell you their feelings, whether their feelings are ones of elation or anxiety or passion or fear. They don't want to do that. They prefer to just preserve this little bubble around them. And so this producer and friend of mine is the one who has to really dig. I can smile, I can shake their hands, I can be around, but fundamentally, unless they speak English, and obviously most of them do not, the heavy lifting in any documentary that we make is made by Hanyi, who's very good at it, and her team, who we have trained to win people over. And I think one of the, if we have a difference in our films and other people's films, it's simply that we get people to trust us and open up to us, and then we can really find out what's going on in here, and more importantly, in here. So
I think what Malcolm has described is 就是内敛是这个词，就是 if in Chinese, 就是 where our emotions are held back, not because we don't have it, it's because we're not as open as, you know, Americans or Europeans. They just put it out there. We tend to held it back, more inwards. So in terms of filmmaking, it is a challenge. But for me, what's the difference is, like, you know, I find making films in China is easier than if I go to United States or Europe, because this is my culture, this is my root. I understand here, I understand people here, and I can talk to them. So for me, it's kind of like a 如鱼得水. You know, it's so different from this one. But I think, but as a team, it's a good balance, and that's why we could easily navigate all these so-called troubled waters, and identify the right story, the right people, and spend time. And one thing is very important in the documentary filmmaking is you just have to spend time with your characters so that they trust you. Sometimes it's very emotionally tiring because you have to let out yourself as well so that they can trust you. It's mutual. You can't just say, ask them for emotional input and you don't. So sometimes after a 6-year project, you're like, okay, I'm so tired emotionally because you have to put in so much. You have to treat them as genuine friends, sometimes even family members. And even till today, I've kept very good relations with all the subjects that we made before, you know, and they would send you New Year greetings and all that. For me, it's a life experience. If you're making film about a boxer and you get to experience their life, you make a film about blind people, you get to see how they experience the world. So it's a very rewarding experience. But certainly, because of our cultural roots, our emotions are so held back. To open up takes much longer. That's true. But that's just the way it is. That's how we were brought up and educated. You know, I remember when I was little, parents always tell you to behave yourself, don't show your your laughter, don't laugh too loud, and don't cry too loud. You always be quiet. So after generations of that kind of upbringing, I've really changed. Yes, thank you. But yeah, so that's a general. I wouldn't call it a problem, but it's just some general. It's a challenge that we have to face as filmmakers here.
Yeah, so Mr. Clarke and Ms. Han has told us a lot about the cultural differences of the Chinese people. But I beg to see it from a different angle, a more contemporary angle. So I'll give you the conclusion first. I think the Chinese people has a very unique way of seeing the history. We have a very unique way of seeing. I think that very unique historicism actually comes from the unique Chinese experiences, right? So the conclusion is that I believe that the Chinese people is at the same time very historical and also very ahistorical. So historical in a sense that we, perhaps due to the past several decades of rapid development, we have this linear kind of reading of historical progression. We believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today, right? Just like today is better than yesterday. And if you see other parts of the world, you see in other society, this is often the privilege of a elite field. But in China, you basically have that sort of default for ordinary people. So for a lot of Chinese, I believe that they're fundamentally optimistic because history will solve itself, right? Time will become better, and everyone's life will be rising with the tide of history, right? This is, I think, a very rare value system, very rare way of seeing the world. So I think it's in this sense that the Chinese is historical, but I think here comes the contradiction. We're also very ahistorical. So in China, when you describe something as ancient or like very old, you say this is from the Qing dynasty. But then the Qing dynasty is not that old, if you see that. So when I was in London studying, and there was this course called Urban Geography, the professors were leading us, touring around London. I was so shocked to see that people were still living in very well-maintained house that dates back to the Georgian era. Yeah, yeah, that was 18th century. So it was perhaps mid-Qing dynasty, right? So people still living in there. But then for the Chinese, perhaps because of our very eventful contemporary history, and also each event comes as a great negation of the previous one, right? So we have, even the recent history for us seems to be quite distant, right? So together, holding together, I think the Chinese people are very much not dwell in the history of the past, but then they're very keenly aware of the history of the future. And I believe that is the thing that makes our very different kind of a mentality from other parts of this world. And that's the thing that really makes other people feel like a bit difficult to experience, a bit difficult to understand. And I think that's actually from the unique contemporary history of China.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. So we just talked about the similarities and differences between China and the rest of the world, probably the West. And then it comes to our question about the difficulty of presenting China to the world, because you're filmmakers who are telling stories about China to the West. And Larry is a doctoral student who is writing about China in English. So I think there's some sort of same challenge that that all of you might face. How to present China to the world is the most efficient way or most effective way? Or what is the biggest difficulty in terms of
well, one of the biggest difficulties is if the Chinese are looking at tomorrow as being better than today, many people in the West are looking at tomorrow and seeing that it's not going to be as good as today, certainly in America. The rhetoric of the American dream has taken a huge hit in the last 20, 25 years. And, you know, the belief that America is the special nation, the golden nation, the golden city on the hill, all of that stuff has been thrown into deep relief and questioned, because it's not happening for the majority of Americans. It's happening for a tiny sliver of the upper middle and upper class, economically speaking. So when Americans, and to a slightly lesser extent, I have to say Europeans too, see China as a burgeoning nation, putting people into space, running competition against, you know, the great American companies, the computer companies, the telephone companies. You know, China is technologically, economically, and educationally, I think, a cutting-edge nation. And it scares them. And I understand, because, you know, every single day that an American grew up From kindergarten onwards, they've put their hand over their heart, they've pledged allegiance to the flag, and they believed absolutely that theirs was the best country in the world. And suddenly, there's a new kid on the block. There's someone else in the sandbox who is giving them competition that they have never had. I mean, I'm old enough to have seen the rise of Japan, when suddenly Japanese cars were coming into America. You know, we were all running around with a device called a Walkman, and they were selling us televisions that were so superior to the old Zenith and televisions that most people had in their living rooms that looked like refrigerators. And the amount of racism, the anti-Japanese racism, was just totally out of control. It was really scary. And Americans don't deal well with competition. And this, unfortunately, is what's happening to China. So China has a challenge, and how it meets that challenge is going to be really interesting and is going to define the next 75 to 100 years. Right now, China has absolutely no concept whatsoever as to how to put a positive spin on what is happening in China without it looking like it's kind of something to be afraid of from a Western point of view. China has a kind of a 3-year-old's understanding of soft power and its application. A tiny little country like South Korea punches way above its weight in terms of soft power we all admire South Korea. I know absolutely nothing about South Korea. I've been there a couple of times. I've stayed in Seoul. I've been to hotels. I've been to film festivals, but I know nothing about the culture. But I do admire what they have managed to pull off. We all remember around, I guess it was 2012, there was this kind of slightly overweight Korean pop star singing Gangnam Style. It completely changed the narrative. One song changed the narrative and the perspective about what South Korea was. Since then, movies, television, Academy Awards that they've won, Squid Game, whatever, we all admire that pop culture, and by extension, we all know a lot more about what South Korea is. Where is China? It's absent. That's a problem. Because soft power is power, and it can change hearts and minds. So what I'm trying to do, I'm no genius. I just see the kind of truisms of my business that sometimes you write a paper, or you write a thesis, or you write a book, but that goes to this part of the human body. If you can go to this part, if you can speak to people's hearts as well as their minds, they're going to remember, and they're going to be at ease, because they're going to think, these guys are just like me, just like my family, just like my peer group, as it were. So that's what I try to do. I always have a little kind of rage inside me when I think about the billions and billions of dollars that China is wasting with this CCTV entity called CGTN, which is the foreign arm of CCTV, which is an absolute travesty. It's throwing money away. Nobody watches it. Nobody likes it. Nobody thinks it's telling the truth. It's CCTV redux for a Western audience. For a fraction of that, the money that the poor Chinese people, because it's all coming out of the pockets of Chinese people. If a fraction of that money was deployed in a more intelligent, soft power way, China would not be scary. China would not be something to be feared. It would be something to be admired, to be revered, and to be taken seriously. Because, we don't necessarily need to think that China is going to eat our lunch. If we do think that, then, Raytheon and McDonnell and all those defense companies making missiles and everything else, they're going to keep getting the money because the Americans are going to feel that they need to spend that money to defend against this country. And I think it's kind of it's a colossal kind of tragedy, actually. It's a waste. It's a waste of human potential, and it's not telling the truth about this country. And I don't think that China is perfect. Just so we all understand, I'm not a big admirer of many things about China. Notwithstanding all that, I still think what has happened is historically unprecedented in the history of the world. The way the Chinese people have turned this country round since 1948 is a historically unprecedented. Let's just say that.
I don't think I have. No, it's fine. I just want to say I don't have further comments because you've made it pretty clear. It's just in this increasingly polarized world, it's very hard to stand in the middle, try to be fair and objective. We've found there's less and less room for this particular position, which is very unfortunate, I think. Because I studied journalism. I was trained as a journalist, and I just found now journalism has changed its flavor. It's not journalism anymore. It's a zero-sum game, and it's fake news all over the place. And I don't like to read, so-called key opinion leaders writing something without fact checks, and everybody take it seriously. So it's all that. So it is a really, really big challenge for us and for all of us, I think, if we ever want to tell Chinese stories to the world. But I do believe that pop culture is the way to go. I mean, you can't sell your philosophy or ideology to them directly. You have to let them feel that there's something fun, something interesting that they like to learn, that like to watch. And hopefully, we can be part of that force that can turn these stories into entertainment, into pop culture, that can be relatively easier for them to accept.
Yeah, thank you. So before I invite Larry to ask his question and also open up the floor to the audience, probably my last question is that, Mr. Clarke, you have made films about children fighting cancer, and also you have made a film about a 109-year-old lady whose devotion to music helped her surviving the Holocaust. And also, you have making films about people in remote areas of China who would have to decide, whether to move out of their old house and move to the newer sort of housing in a county seat. So, from all these diverse subjects and of your films, what is the common theme? What is the shared theme of it? Probably I will ask Larry to give his comment, and then you can respond whether it's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question, but also a good question. I've been watching many documentary films made by Mr. Clarke, and as you said, they are actually having a very sparse interest. But if I may, I think there is a common theme about how the ordinary people fighting their fight with optimism, right? From the old lady in the Nazi prison, the concentration camp, to the Chinese people fighting their fight in their little village against poverty, right? I think there is all this kind of a human spirit in against all odds, fighting with optimism. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's a correct reading.
Well, you don't, when you're making films, you don't think about this stuff. You just, you need to kind of stand back and look back at the last 25 years and say, oh, look, how interesting. All these films have this in common. But it's not something which is, I don't go around looking for that. I mean, I obviously I have to have, I have to feel an emotional connection with whatever the subject is. But yes, in a sense, I'm just thinking back all the way to, yeah, I mean, it's David and Goliath, isn't it? It's like, the little guy against, the institution or the pervasive orthodoxy, whatever. If it's a 6-year-old boy who gets cancer, then cancer is the other, is the Goliath, is the thing he has to beat. And how is he going to beat it? What inner resources is he going to muster as a kid to fight this scary monster, which is cancer? What's interesting is that many oncologists say that one of the reasons that children survive cancer at a much higher rate than adults is not because they have a better immune system or a younger immune system. It's because of the psychological dimension. They don't realize how sick they are. And many humans, male and female, who are adults, when they have a cancer diagnosis, they give in. They get frightened. They lose hope. They stop trying. They stop struggling. And they accept their fate. Kids are full of optimism. Kids always think tomorrow is going to be better than today. And it is, for the most part. So, yes, I made a film about a Holocaust survivor. She went to a camp called Theresienstadt, which was not a death camp, actually. It was a feeder camp for Auschwitz. But she survived, I think, largely because she was a concert pianist, and every day she managed in this camp to find a piano and play music, and she kept her spirits up and the spirits of the camp inmates. And I again, the Nazis were, obviously they were kind of, in 20th century terms, evil incarnate. And yet she managed not to give up. She managed to fight. The same is true of these basically Chinese peasants, very, very, very poor people. But somehow, although they were frightened of moving out of the village, and their village was a terrible place. I mean, it was from the roofs leaked, but it was their village. It was their home. It was their culture. And we're all afraid, myself included, I think we're all to some extent afraid of change. We feel comfortable where we are. We understand it. We understand the kind of the emotional geography of where we live and eat and exist. So to have to go over the hill to an unknown future was quite frightening. And yet they did it. Why? Because of their kids, because they wanted a better future for their kids, which is why when we show that film to Westerners, everybody gets it, because everybody in this room, everybody probably in this city will do anything to have a better future for their children. So these are just kind of fundamental building blocks of making a documentary. Every one of these documentaries is different, and yet, you're absolutely right, at the heart of them is the small man or woman taking on a huge challenge and beating it.
I don't have more to add. I think, Larry has summarized it quite well. And I think just from pure filmmaking experience, every single time when we go out to make a film, we're always looking for interesting, compelling characters to tell their stories. We didn't really set up a goal and say, okay, we have to find this person. But if you do your research well and thoroughly, you would eventually find someone just so fascinating, and you have to tell their story. So I think it's more like that. Yeah.
Okay, now probably we can go into a more interactive mode, so that we will invite people and members of the audience to ask questions, and then we'll have some interaction for the next 10 minutes. Probably Larry has a question to ask first, and then we open the floor. Yeah.
Right. So I know that Mr. Clarke, you're a great admirer of the French poet Baudelaire, right? He has this concept of flaneur, which is a man who goes to a foreign society observing whilst remain detached and hidden from the society, right? So I think that's a perfect analogy of documentary film making, right? Because you're also trying to demonstrate what is happening in China and other parts of the world without a clear and guided narrative, right? But my question is, you've made films in the most remote areas of China, right? Deep in the mountain. But then I think your very presence with a camera in the field would somehow be seen as a participation. Yeah, and how do you deal with this kind of a participated observation, so to speak?
I think one thing that we have to admit, and we'd be foolish not to admit it, is that we're not telling the truth. We're telling a version of the truth, which has been kind of refracted through the lens of a camera. And the moment you bring a camera there are 3 cameras back here, or 4 or something. And the fact that they are there means that we're all behaving differently. Certainly we are behaving differently. And we're professionals. But when you go into a room in a tiny little house in the mountains of Yunnan, and you pull out a camera, which is this, like this, it's huge, it's a scary thing. It's like pulling out a gun. And people get very twitchy, they get very anxious, and they behave differently because they know that this talismanic presence is is in their house. They don't understand it, but they know that. I remember Lewis and Clark writing about when they pulled a camera out with the Mandans, who were a plains Indian tribe, and the Mandans believed that the camera was going to steal their soul. We hear this a lot from anthropologists. Well, I think that's to some extent true. People are going to behave differently. We're not seeing them behave. If you have a camera in the room, you're not going to walk around with your trousers down. Whereas if there's nobody in the room, you'll take off your pants and go and get in bed. It's natural. So there's always a difference in human behavior when we are around. So we can't, in good conscience, say that we're not affecting reality. The idea is to affect it as glancingly as possible, to make the least amount of anthropological change. All anthropologists know that when they go out into the field, the people that they're studying are going to behave differently because they are there collecting data. We're just the same. We're kind of social anthropologists. Our tool is the camera and the interview but we're still changing reality. That's just, and if we don't admit that, then we're frankly fooling ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And to a certain, to some degree, journalism is the same. What is journalism? Is journalism 100% truth? For me, it's just an interpretation of truth, right? You go out, you interview someone, how you choose this interviewee, and how you set up your camera angle, it's all very subjective. So our documentary is our point of view, is how we see this through our eyes. And it's one version. It's just like, it's like a diamond. There are all kinds of facets. And, we are trying our best to show the interesting aspect of this diamond, and hopefully, by offering more interpretations like this, in the end, you will make your own judgment rather than we telling you, what to believe and what to think. So I think as a documentary filmmaker, we are limited in a way by our camera, but also we're blessed with our camera, so that we're able to, if we can convince people and gain their trust, we have the privilege to tell their stories and share their stories to a wider audience, and hopefully get more emotionally connection with a wider audience. So we're both cursed and both blessed with the camera.
Yeah. Thank you. So probably we can open up the floor. I know there are two secondary school students here today from the affiliated school of the Hong Kong U Alumni Association. So probably we can give our first opportunity to the two younger members of the audience. Yeah, please. Middle school student.
Good evening.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I would like to ask a question. Do you think that any work can be done on the recipient side of the documentary? That if you were to, since you stated that your mission is to sort of bridge the two nations of China and the West in general, do you think that is there any work that can be done to sort of change the mentality of the West beyond just changing how China presents herself? Because based on my observation, a lot of Westerners or even some Hong Kong people are very resentful to anything that is mildly related to the Chinese narrative. So I'm wondering if any work can be done to sort of widen the access to your documentaries beyond just the documentary itself and how it presents China.
I think it's a very good question, and certainly it's a challenge for us. We are every day struggling, try to find better ways to build a bridge, and hopefully, from simple things like make our documentary seen by a wider audience, which is already a challenge in itself. But certainly, I mean, going to university like this and have talks like this is one way to do it, right? Other than the traditional way of distribution films. And if we could do more talks like this, more communication in different institutes and schools and universities, and certainly that would help. But I think just as filmmakers, it's too great a challenge to do alone. We need everybody to work together to make this happen. We do need support. We need the words to get out. We need more systematic support to help distribute all this related content, especially in such a polarized world, which anything China friendly will be labeled China propaganda. So that's,
The other thing that I think we have decided to do in our little corner of the universe, we have a small kind of a boutique filmmaking company. And, most of the stuff we do is documentaries, but we have to also be kind of brutally honest with ourselves about the catchment area for documentary films. Lots of people don't watch documentary films. Interestingly, documentaries are enjoying a kind of resurgence right now because the geniuses who run Netflix and Amazon and Disney and Hulu and are realizing that a documentary costs a fraction of a dramatic film, and they still get people to watch. So they're actually putting a lot more money into the production of documentaries because it's cheap programming, and they can drum up an audience which is complementary to the kind of dramatic stuff that they show. But I think there's something else that we can do. We made a film as part of a long-cherished dream. It was the second film in the series of 4, and it was a film about a young woman who was like 20, 21 years old, and she was a long-distance truck driver. She's this big. She's like a hobbit. She's a very small woman, but she drove this huge 18-wheel truck across China. And it was a very successful film as a documentary. It was on Tencent. So what we've decided to do is take her story and turn it into a drama, to actually expand it, to tell more of her story. It's a marvelous story which basically says everything about poverty in China and how to get away from poverty and how China has helped people, as I said right at the beginning of this talk. It helped people to dream, because if you're living in poverty, you have little hope of a better future. But if you can get out of poverty, then you can start to have ambition. You can start to have dreams. That's what this film is about. And I suspect that if we don't muck it up and make a terrible movie, but if we make a good movie on this good subject, this is something we can show both in China, but also overseas. And I think one of our kind of secret ambitions is that a film on a Chinese subject, which is not about something historical, it's about the here and now, the present day, that a film about what has been achieved in China can play in the West, possibly win a film festival, probably be entered into competitions and get noticed abroad. That's one way that we can expand what we do and find a bigger audience overseas.
Our time is almost up, so I wonder if there's any questions from the audience. Yeah, please.
Mr. Clarke, you have just mentioned about the concept of Renaissance during the Fireside Chat. And externally can reflect on China's significant improvements in economic and technology, which frightens the West. But internally, Renaissance has also become a theme of China. Like it's everywhere, our government papers or even slogans on the street. And I've watched the film, the first 2 films of the Long Trash Stream, and I noticed that the film is about ordinary people that have tough lives similar to everyone else. And in your observation, how did the concept introduced by government, the Renaissance, this concept has been identified by these ordinary people, and how these ordinary people has contributed themselves into this concept?
I mean, the Chinese government have done a very good job of giving the Chinese people hope, of raising expectations. They say that by the end of this decade, there will be 500 million middle-class people. The people in that village in Yunnan can't escape knowing that. They must know it. And they must know, because it's in the zeitgeist, it's everywhere. And they must know that their opportunity is linked to getting on that ladder, that escalator. And I think that's why they realize that it's probably too late for them as adults. They're middle-aged people, but they have kids. They have a teenage girl, they have a little kid, and they are taking a risk with their existence by saying, I'd love to stay here because I understand it, but we'll go over the hill and we'll gamble on we'll gamble our family's future for our kids to have the opportunity to live a better life. And the one thing that I think, I say a lot, and I'm pretty well sure of it when I say it, is that almost certainly everybody in this room is living a better life than their parents lived, and their grandparents. Everybody has raised the standards of their families living, and that has to be put at the doorstep of the Chinese government. It's just a fact of life. We may love them, we may hate them, they did achieve this, and that's a historic achievement. So what we have to try and do is to interpret that achievement in a way that is not going to be resisted, which is it's just an acceptance. It's just a fact of life. It's not, we don't have to be afraid of it, but it is something which should be admired, and it is something that should be noted, because it's a model which has worked in China because of a psychopathology, because the Chinese people are very special people with a special civilization. They work especially hard. It's a cliche, but it's also the truth. But if some of what has happened in China can be transposed to countries in South America or in Africa or even in the Middle East, that can help the world. Because I tell you this, America doesn't give a damn about raising the standard of living of the average Ethiopian or Sudanese or Colombian. They don't care. They are fundamentally an imperial power. And China, although it has all kinds of faults, I do not think China is an imperial power. So, that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to demythologize the reality of what has been happening in this country.
Okay, so our time is up probably. May I suggest we give a applause together to thank our guests for the wonderful chat today, and also our guests in dialogue.
Thank you all. Ms. Clarke and Ms. Han, please remain on the stage. On behalf of the Research Hub on Institutions of China, Dr. Yan will present a souvenir to you. Thank you, Ms. Clarke. Yeah, thank you. We have now come to the end of today's talk. Let's give a big round of applause for our speakers today. Thank you very much for your support and participation. It's been our pleasure to host this event, and I wish you all a pleasant day and happy Chinese New Year. Thank you.